preparing the live stream. Give me another couple seconds. Okay, and it seems that we are live. Yay, great. So welcome everyone. My name is Victoria from Product People. I'm your host for tonight. And we're very happy that you joined us for this series of product management meetups. Product People is a product management consultancy based in Germany, but also spreading to other countries currently. And we are also a community builder, so we like to bring people together, people who are curious or interested or working already in product management, and we invite the best product management leaders to share their insights in the industry. Please join our community chat on Telegram if you want to share, if you want to ask questions. We're very welcome, all kinds of inquiries there. And if you like our meetings, please support us on Patreon because we are running this voluntarily, and your support helps us to run this with the proper tools that we actually need to pay for. And I also want to thank our new patron who joined us recently, Gabrielle. Thank you very much for supporting us. And if anyone else is also inspired by Gabrielle's example, please check for Product People on Patreon, and you can help us by supporting us there. And now, without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll invite our speaker, Johnny from Hostelworld, who will tell us more about creating value as a product manager. Please, Johnny, welcome on stage. We're happy if you're also, yeah, exactly. See your face, thanks, and share your screen.
Cool. Sweet. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but I realized that maybe some introduction would be good. I just realized in the deck I didn't talk about that. So yeah, my name is Johnny Quach. I work at a company called Hostelworld. Hostelworld is a 21-year-old online travel agency business model. What we do is we help travelers connect to hostels and then find cool places to stay. What we believe as a company is that we want to build an experiential travel company. So we believe that travel is much more than booking accommodations. And that's generally the strategy and the direction we want to bring the company. So with that being said, before that, I worked at a company called AirHelp. AirHelp is a Y Combinator company from 2014 class. When I joined, it was about, I think, 350, 400 people. By the time I left, it was about 800 people. And during those 3.5 awesome years, we 7x pretty much every metric and broke every record 4 times. And before that, I worked at a company called Rocket Internet, building companies globally across the globe in different spaces and different business models. In reality, I think the only thing that really mattered is building things quickly and at scale. And before that, I worked at a company called Match.com. It's the biggest online dating company in the world. They own a few of the companies you might have heard of: Tinder, OkCupid. Pretty much every major dating product in the world comes from that company. And before that, I've done a variety of funny things in my career, but I've also built companies in China. I've built products in China. That's when the iPhone first came out. So in my current role and my previous role, the majority of my team, I manage all of engineering, all of product, all of data science, all of design, all of localization, and pretty much any topic that touches upon technology or anything close to it. At Hostelworld, I manage close to around 140 people spread over many different disciplines and many different business units and many different product lines and decisions. So needless to say, I've been involved with most things related to product management. And more importantly, I've dealt with most problems that have come up in product management. And still to this day, new ones surprise me all the time. I would say this year is a beautiful example of something you can't predict. So with that being said, I think the biggest problem, and I'm going to share my screen now, and just let me know when this is working correctly.
Looks good.
Good? Okay, good. How do I get rid of that thing? Oh, go away, talking thing. Okay. So as I mentioned, I think as a product manager, and really any person in the world in any kind of company, especially a startup or a fast moving tech company, you're going to run into many decisions in your life. You're going to run into many decisions at work, what feature you should build, what things you should look at, what data you should analyze, what users you should focus on, what business model, blah, 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 blah. And the problem there is typically when a product owner, product manager, any person joins a company, there's no shortage of things to focus on. It's never ever the case where you join a company and there's nothing to work on. That's actually the most common problem, is that there's too many things to chase, too many opportunities to look at. And so the theory behind this kind of concept is that I'm going to walk you through a very simple way and a very simple framework to always understand if you're working on the right thing, but also if you're working on the right stage of something you're working on. And this will apply to if you want to build your own company. This will apply to the products you build. This will apply to the features you want to build, and pretty much any key decision that comes to you interacting with another person. So value creation, a framework for working on the right thing. So if you are going to doze off on this talk and you're not going to get a chance to really focus for the rest of this, all you actually need to do is remember this one slide. This slide tells you everything you need to know when it comes to making a decision on if something is worth focusing on. So everything starts with a problem. When you solve the problem, you create value. To create value and solve the problem, you create a product. Once the problem is solved by the product, you grow it. So it's very simple, but if you think about it this way, is that a problem is the reason value is created. Problems are the center of how value is created in the world. The car is the perfect example. No one knew they wanted the car because they had horses. But when you solve a problem and you solve it so damn good, you create so much more value. But the problem is still the same. I need to get from point A to B. When you create value, the thing here is that most of the time, and it's not always true, but most of the time, the value is delivered through a product or service. Now, it's not always true, but it is the case for many, many things. And for the sake of this argument, for the sake of this audience, you want to deliver value for a product. And when your product is delivering value that solves a problem, what you want to do is start to think about growth for that product. Some really common mistakes that companies, startups, corporations, product managers, data analysts, engineers, lawyers, whatever, is that they treat all these things as separate things and they approach them in the wrong order. I'm not a big stickler for process, but this is a fundamental truth in the world that none of these things exist out of order. You might discover them in different order, but how they function and exist with each other is always the same. So you must always start at this point. You solve for these two first. So you think about the absolute problem you're trying to solve and what is the value that is derived when you solve that problem. You notice how it says here, you solve for these two first. So you define the problem, you think about the requirements of the problem, and you think about the value you want to extract from solving that problem. If you have a conversation with your team only on these two words, and you never talk about what the product should do, you never talk about what the feature should function like, you never talk about how you would get more users to use it, and you focus only on the problem you're trying to solve and the value you would give from solving it, you'll start correctly and you will start in the right mental state for answering every single feature or product or marketing or scaling or growing decision you will ever come to. But it always starts with understanding the problem and understanding the value you will deliver by solving that problem. Once you have delivered value from solving a problem through a product, this is what everyone defines as product market fit. I'm not going to talk super in depth what product market fit is. There's a lot of good content out there. But simply put, product market fit means there is a percentage of people that will keep using your product when most of them leave, but that percentage of people will continue to use it. So every time you add more people, you'll always have some percentage of people you're adding that are new users that will continue to use it. So product market fit is a science and art. The science part is your retention stays stable at some percentage. And the art part is you go from pushing your product to people pulling for it. You notice that most companies never reach this point. It's because they don't understand the problem and they don't understand the value they're trying to deliver. If you find a problem that is big enough and you're able to solve it and the value is big enough, you will have product market fit. Once you have product market fit, the natural next thing is to, and I'll get to the growth thing in a second. So the top reasons that most startups fail, as I mentioned, is that they make products no one wants. But that's too vague of a statement. What it really means is they built products that solve problems that no one cared to be solved. Every single startup that fails, that built something, that got in front of people, they fail because no one thought that problem was worth solving and no one thought that problem was big enough to keep using whatever that was built. So product without a problem, aka no product market fit, is deadly. It is the cause of most companies' demise. Even big companies with long history of successful products, for example, Pepsi. So David Novak was the ex-CEO of Pepsi, was concerned that he had a vision that he wanted to build a Pepsi that was clear. Now, however close he got the actual look and feel of the product, he never solved the problem that the flavor of the drink wasn't right. It wasn't that the UI of the bottle was bad. It wasn't like the marketing was bad. It wasn't like the branding was bad. Actually, all those things were very good. But the core problem that a bottle of soda is supposed to solve, which is quench your thirst and give you that sugar rush that you're craving, it didn't do that. So it doesn't matter if you hired the best damn agency in the universe to design you the best, coolest naming, branding bottle, and you put all the money behind it. If no one thinks the drink is tasting good and it makes them not thirsty and it keeps them coming back for more, it doesn't solve the problem they're trying to solve and no one will use it. Now, too often companies, especially product managers and especially any kind of company, they put so much focus on the product and not enough on the value or the problem. This is problematic for multiple reasons. And this is a statement that is extremely controversial, but I certainly stand by it, which is bad products that deliver clear value to big problems usually are successful. I would say above the 80% threshold. If you have a bad product, a bad, ugly, hard to use product, and it is the only thing in the world that solves the problem and delivers that clear value, it is usually going to be successful. And I'll give you an example of this. Craigslist. It's a product it's a company that's much more familiar in America. It's also, everyone knows it. But in America, it's really dominant, especially when I lived there. Craigslist is by far one of the ugliest websites in the world today, but one of the most useful. And at the same time, the website and the actual product, if you want to call it the experience, the UI, the UX, this has been the same for multiple years. Now, Craigslist was built in 1999. That's a long time ago. It's live in 700 cities, in 70 countries. It has, this is not a joke, 1 billion in revenue. This is USD, 1 billion in revenue with 50 employees. Roughly, that is a lot of hundreds of millions per employee that each employee generates. Craigslist, and most people don't know this, has more visitors than Netflix. The CEO is not interested in growing revenue and never has been. And the funny thing here is that with Craigslist, it is the definition of a product that has never been innovated, a UI that has never been redesigned, a user experience that has never had a user research session. None of those things happen. And yet, you have one of the most successful products and one of the most productive companies in the world by headcount. This is not an anomaly. This happens all the time. Bad products that deliver value, that solve big problems, are usually successful. I'll give you everyone's favorite example: unreliable, unstable, slow, hard to use. This is all the words that describe Skype. Has always described Skype after its acquisition from Microsoft, or through Microsoft. It has always been unreliable. It has always been unstable. It's always been slow and hard to use. And even with the redesign 4 years ago, it became even more unreliable, more unstable, and still hard to use. And yet, to this very single day in 2020, the users of Skype continue to grow. It has, and this is where people often forget, 1.67 billion users. And it generates $2 billion in revenue in 2014. Now think about that for a second. How many times have you been on a Skype call where you and the other person are complaining how Skype doesn't work well? And yet, why is it so successful? Because it solves still a problem, a big problem that generates a lot of value. It doesn't matter that there are competitors that have a better product. Eventually that might catch up. But in the current last, 10, 11 years, Skype has been the dominant player in video conference. And there is no player really that ever came to bat. Right now, that might be changing, expedited by COVID-19. But that doesn't veer away from the key point here: is bad products, even unreliable products, unstable products, slow products, and hard to use products that solve a problem, that generate a big amount of value, are usually successful. Now, that's easy to say, but the first thing is, the hard part people think is building the right product. And this is the mistake with every company and every product manager's thinking. That's not the hard work. The hard work is figuring out the problem and seeing it. The problem is the hardest, most elusive thing to look for. And that's why you read any kind of entrepreneurship or tech book, they always say, start by solving a problem you experience yourself. That's not actually such accurate advice. It is true. It's a good starting point. But the reason most companies and most individuals suggest that is because at least you know there's a real problem, at least for yourself. But problems are not easy to spot. Big problems are even harder to spot. There's nothing wrong with the way a mall worked in the 90s. There's nothing wrong with the way hotels worked in the 90s. There's nothing wrong, technically, with the way taxis worked. And yet all three of these have been disrupted and kind of destroyed by new companies, right? And the weird thing is, before these companies existed, those were the only things that solved that problem, that created that value, that became that successful. And then these companies said, these things are working fine, but these things they're not doing well. We could do some of the things they're doing bad even better. So Amazon didn't say, let's sell things to people like a mall. That's the problem. No. Amazon said, people are buying things at malls, but what if we can get those things to people faster and make the shopping experience even easier? Now that is focusing on the same problem that creates the same value, but focusing on what that product offering looks like and how you can improve those problems. Airbnb, I don't recall a time in my life before Airbnb existed where I said, I really hate hotels. I really can't wait to sleep in someone's random bedroom. That's never been the case. However, the problem Airbnb solves is that for people to travel, there were only two price points: hotels and hostels. Everything else in between did not exist. So there was a group of people in the middle of that value chain that resonated with the value offering, which is solving a problem that Airbnb provided. The same can be said for taxis. But the answer, the commonalities, it's clear. You solve a big enough problem and most people can't see their problems. No one thought taxis were a problem. There's a lot of things people complain about taxis, but that in itself was not the problem, right? It is the things you don't see that are the big problems. And when you solve that, you create massive value. So focusing on the same problem, because when you identify a problem that is so starkly big, but then you can't seem to solve it in the correct way, or you can't solve it with the right product. When you change the product or the value, but you're still trying to solve the same problem, that's what you call a pivot. The definition of pivot is a change in strategy, but you maintain the same vision. And that's the vision of the problem. And if you get here, which very few companies do, very few companies ever get here, where they have a problem, they can solve the problem, they have a product, this is the time in which you start thinking about growth. The most common problem is that you start growth without the product or the value or the problem. And once you have defined product market fit and you start to build growth, you want to repeat the same thought process for every market you want to enter, for every product you want to build, and for every feature you want to add to your product. And you repeat this over and over and over again. Because when you are a company that reaches product market fit, there's only two things to do. Number one, scale growth, scale the product everywhere. And the second thing you need to do, build a new product, build new features. And that is what you do as a company. You keep repeating these steps at every single maturity state of every product. So in summary, your goal is to solve problems, not build products. As product managers, as marketing managers, as analysts, as designers, it doesn't really matter. Your role in a company and your role in any kind of business is the same. You got to solve a problem. You're not here to build products. Growth is only something you should focus heavily on when you have product market fit. When you know people are using your product without heavy focus on growth, that is when you know you have product market fit. And then you start thinking about growth. Don't skip around the steps. Try to always pull yourself back. What is the problem I'm trying to solve? What is the value I'm delivering when I solve it? And then you talk about the product and the feature and the user stories and the requirements. But none of that is relevant until you define the first two things. So that was my talk. Short and sweet. And I have one favor to ask of everyone who's looking at this. I would love it if you could give me some feedback on the talk. If you scan this QR code, it should send you to a Google form where you can just write anonymous feedback. I'm obviously not going to get mad. But yes, it really helps me do a better job of creating this kind of content and also telling these kind of stories. So yeah, any kind of feedback would be fantastic. And I'll just leave this up as I stop sharing. How do I do this? Maybe I'll stop sharing. I'll leave it up for a minute. And I can maybe take questions while I leave this up.
Sure. Yeah, I'm also posting a link to Johnny's YouTube if you want to check more of his talks. And we are open for questions. You guys are welcome to raise your hand if you know the function, or just turn on your camera and start talking, and we'll hopefully hear you.
Yes, I have a question, and sorry, I don't know the hand feature. Second time I do that, but thank you very much, Johnny, for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. Super cool ideas and things to keep in the back of our mind. But I have a quick question for you, right? I'm currently a product manager for a very technical product. So it's like the dispatching service of an algorithm for delivery. And obviously it's super technical. So how would you pivot, or how would you do this for such products? I know you've worked with data scientists and engineers, and I just wanted to get your feedback on this if possible.
So if I just to understand the question, you're working on a very technical product, and how to kind of apply this kind of thinking?
Yep.
Okay. For me, it does not seem so different, because I think if you're building something very technical, and I think the problem with quote unquote technical product manager roles, when this kind of title or this kind of role is hired, typically the solution and the product and the feature have already been defined. And what they want is they want someone to come into the company and manage the product, or no, the execution of the building from a technical point of view. So in reality, by the time you're thinking as a company to hire a technical product manager, you've already kind of defined that problem and that value and all that stuff already. In reality, you're hiring someone to execute. So I would say that's one nuance of a quote unquote technical product role. Now, this could also be wrong in the sense that maybe as a company, you believe that you have a product that generates value for customers and you have a great product. However, underneath all that, there's lots of problems with the actual technical implementation or technical builder or whatever. There lies that the problem and the value that you're trying to solve and you deliver is not for the customer. It is maybe for your internal teams. Maybe it's for your developers. Maybe it's for the seamless integration into the finance department. Maybe it's something like that. So I think the first thing I would ask yourself is, what is the problem you're trying to solve for which customer? Is it internal? Is it external? Is it consumers at the end of the day? Is it developers? Is it intellectual property or whatever? So once you start with that, I think it's quite easy to kind of roll to the next steps. But remember, defining the problem is the hardest part. So I wouldn't say it's an easy thing to go, well, clearly this is the problem XYZ. So I think a bit more focus on understanding who you're trying to solve the problem for will actually lead you in the right direction. Because I believe in your role, what you'll often run into is you might come to a decision on a feature or a product or whatever, where one decision might optimize a better experience for the customer at the end of the day, but the other decision might optimize your development efforts internally. So one, you might deliver to a feature faster for a consumer that reaches that value from something else you're building. And the other thing, you improve the lives of your internal team. And I think in those scenarios, it is very important to understand which is the problem you want to solve and what is the reason for the existence of the team. And once you do that, all those things and all those discussions about prioritization and blah, 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 this will go away much more naturally.
So I do have a question.
Thank you very much.
Oh.
Great, go on, Christoph. Yeah.
Yes. What techniques and strategies do you use to validate the value and the problems you're trying to solve? So basically, I guess when you're looking for problems, you possibly may found a couple. And how do you choose those which seems the most relevant, and how do you validate that basically before going into the product phase and doing your efforts there, or if you do that, of course. So
yeah, so the validation, if you found a real problem or a real value, it's similar methods to how people think about product market fit. And I think the product market fit piece is they have a product, so they're measuring how that product is performing against their problem and value. So the phase before that, typically, if people think that either A, you don't have a product, or you do have a product, and it's binary. But this is completely untrue in the current state of the world. You can build many things with no effort, and those things can help you validate with as real data as possible. Now, some of the methods I use, and I use all the same methods most product managers use, but I do use something else I think many product managers underuse, which is what I would call something called mock tests or smoke tests or Wizard of Oz tests. So typically what I do is I go, okay, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And maybe we say something like, and I'll use an example for, let's say Uber. We think that people are having a hard time booking a ride. And maybe you go, well, it's because people don't understand how to type in the address, right? So this is the problem we're trying to solve. And we believe by delivering this value, that looks like more people would actually do a search for a ride. And so either A, I can then go and change the entire UI to make it easier to book, make the button bigger, make the search form more obvious, make the autofill, add in all the fuzzy logic. I could do all that with the assumption that that is a true problem. But the easiest thing to do is actually to build the UI out, but without the functionality. So you might do the fuzzy logic where you only do it for certain terms, for example, maybe only certain addresses. You might change the UI, but you change the UI, but the buttons don't do anything. So when you click them, it'll say something like, this feature is being worked on. And when you build enough of these kind of what I call mock tests, what you're going to end up with is a ton of real user interaction and data. So real that you can take those percentages or that usage volume, and you can create a model to understand how much this is worth. It's actually really easy to build a business case for a feature or a product if you have people clicking on crap. And this is where prototyping is good, but not real enough. So yes, user interviews, yes, do prototyping, yes, do surveys, but definitely do the last part, which is build the feature as real as possible with the least amount of effort to validate the rest. Because none of those methods independently are very useful. Instead, you want to look at them as a layering mechanism where you do all these, and through all of it, you notice people keep saying the same thing. And here we have people clicking the thing that says it'll solve that thing. That is the safest bet you're going to get, is build as much fake features as you can into a product. And obviously limit it to a small group and then make them not super disappointed and sad. But that is the most real data you can ever have as a company.
Okay, and can I have a follow-up on that then? And
there are no rules.
Okay, great. So what would you do for, because the example you gave is probably working great for products which are already on the market and have some number of users, right? And what would you do in case of a startup or a smaller product that, well, might have a trouble to get that kind of feedback from the users? So how would you approach that then?
So let's keep using the Uber example. I think there's many books and kind of history of many startups, and many startups do this in the beginning of their years, which is they do everything by hand. And so if you imagine we started Uber tomorrow and Uber didn't exist and we never had any idea, and we go, well, is there really a problem here? I don't know. What should we do? How do we build it? I mean, what you could do is build a mobile app that has all the buttons that when you call a car, I just call a taxi company to come get you. That's one way to do it. I know that sounds crazy, but you can easily hire 5 people, just call other services. If you do that, you will get as real data as you can get. And you can validate everything. And it is not costly because you don't spend development time. You don't go dark for 2 months building something that might work. You really get into the mind. You really get in front of users. You really get people using the service. So pretty much every single idea, not every single idea, but a huge majority of ideas can be done manually. People just often don't think tech companies should do that. And therefore that limits the way they can quickly execute something to truly get data, to get feedback. So there is always a creative way to validate these things, I think, most of the time.
Okay, really appreciate interesting point of view. So might test it that way. So thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. I also have a question, Johnny. So why Craigslist wasn't disrupted? What do you think?
This is it's actually another talk I think I'm thinking about creating, but there's been so much content that I'm so inspired by already. But I won't spend too much time on this because it's not my expertise, but it is something I'm obsessed with. And the reason for that is something called network effects. I think many people have heard of this term, but many people do not really understand the core concepts of it. And I'll give a story that I heard on a podcast, and the podcast is called NFX. I don't want to take credit for this story, but the story is that in Amazon's early days, while they were growing really fast, there was a conversation from Jeff Bezos that he wanted to kill eBay. He wanted to beat eBay. He wanted to build the eBay. He wanted to build an eBay competitor and destroy eBay. That actually never happened. And still to this day, it actually hasn't happened. The reason for that is because in any kind of marketplace, Craigslist is a marketplace. There's buyers, there's sellers. The difference is Craigslist has a buyer can also be a seller. And eBay is also one of the same kind of marketplaces. Now, the reason is so hard to disrupt these companies is because when you have enough high value users on one side of the marketplace and you have a huge amount of value on the other side of the marketplace, so supply demand, once you have a significant amount where all the users and from the supply and demand side are tied together for a multitude of things, what you create is a bunch of nodes that are connected by bonds. And when you have a strong enough network where you're so tied into the rest of your network, and every time you add a new user or a new product to sell, that makes the whole network more valuable, you create this very, very concrete network effects. And in reality, there have been many things in the world that protect companies, but network effects is by far one of the most defensible concepts out there. It's more powerful than brand. It's more powerful than embedding. It's more powerful than any other kind of moat. Network effects. Now, I'm not the expert on this. I once again would suggest people to read a blog called NFX. You'll read a lot more on it. But Craigslist's survival is based on the fact they were able to scale so much supply and demand, which constantly drives the other side of the coin. And once you get to this scale, it's actually really hard to disrupt it. It's really hard to get users off of it. Versus a similar thing like, let's say, Uber, it's actually a little easier, right? Because you're not so tied into the driver. You're actually just tied into the actual car ride, which is why you have formidable competitors in the world.
That's interesting. So in other words, if we want to create a new product, we should rather not look for problems that are already solved by good marketplaces, but for other problems, because marketplaces, if they're good, they might create this network effect.
By just naturally it will happen. I think the opportunity here is that if you think about Airbnb, you have hotels and you have customers or travelers. I think the problem there is there's no true loyalty and there's no true connection. There's only a transaction. And I think with Airbnb, the thing that they've done really well is they understand what adding a new property or adding a new user to the network means, which is, I don't know if you remember, and it's still the case, you review everyone. As a traveler, you get reviewed, but you also review the actual property. And what this does is it creates high value users, high value demand, high value supply. And once you create a very high value network, it is so hard to break apart. It can be done and it will take time, but it's very rare and it's very rarely happened in history, at least at a fast rate. Yeah.
What do you think is the story behind Skype and Zoom? So you made a good point that Skype, even though everyone was unhappy with it, was a super successful product. But then now in the quarantine, market changed or the situation changed.
I think, so I don't know the numbers too well. I'm sure there's a fairly decent amount of % of people who are switching from Skype to Zoom. But and this is just a feeling, it's just also my instinct. It's not something I can base on any data. But from what I can tell, it seems that Zoom attracts a lot of users that weren't using Skype. It attracts a lot of people that weren't using video conference ever. My mom, my dad, they're great examples. They don't work in tech. They work in logistics. They've never done a video call in like 10 years. Think about how many people in the world don't do video calls normally before COVID-19. And think about how many people have to do video calls after COVID-19. It makes sense that every player that has video conference in the months of April and March had crazy growth. Of course, because most people haven't used a video conference. Now, I'm pretty sure people who were using Skype actually still use Skype. It is when they interact with someone who does not use Skype, they might be asked to use Zoom. So I think there's a lot of dynamics there with retained users versus new users. But I think that people often forget, when, especially people in tech, is that most people don't do video calls. And so there's a huge amount of people that haven't had this problem solved yet, and now they need it solved. And that's why both companies are probably scaling like crazy.
Non-users is also very interesting market always, right?
Non-users that are forced to be users is an even better market. So,
does anyone has more questions? I have more to ask actually.
Yeah, so I think in terms of Skype though and Zoom, I think Skype was also probably so popular that it was not used that often. I mean, because I've actually switched to Zoom a couple of years ago, because I was involved in many, let's say, calls between UK and sometimes US. And I just found that Skype wasn't reliable enough. And then we had to switch to Zoom, and then we were happy back then. But when I was just using it once a month or a couple times a year, it was just as good as any other app. And I really didn't care if it hanged once or twice. So I think that might be also a factor here, that it wasn't, used very regularly.
Johnny, I'm wondering if you have any tips how to spot these big problems. As you said, it is very difficult. And like when everyone is using horses, how do you realize that there might be a better solution?
I think I don't have any tips on spotting problems. I think for me, that assumes there is an inherent skill to spotting problems. And I think that's a
Mm.
misconception in the world, that some people, especially entrepreneurs, are good at seeing problems. That's not true. I think what entrepreneurs and just successful people in general do is they're able to mobilize very quickly what they want to do, and they're able to iterate. And unfortunately, like most answers in engineering and product development, life is just about iteration. But the key here is people iterate faster and some people iterate slower. So the goal here is you want to iterate faster. That is the way to success, is that you do more things quicker than other people so you know what is working. And there's no magic answer, because velocity is the key factor for startups being successful compared to big companies solving a similar problem. So if that is the one independently special thing about startups, then velocity is the thing you need to always think about.
I have a quick question for you, Johnny. What are your favorite like 2, 3 podcasts that you would want to share with us to that you gain a lot of insights from?
This has changed quite a bit, I think, as I got a little bit older. I think that's one thing, but also changed a lot in terms of what my day-to-day looks like. I think when I was a product manager, thinking about what the best UI is, how to convince a user to do this and all that stuff, and thinking about those strategies, I think I was really obsessed with just anything that gave me tactical ideas, like, oh, you should make a button this way, or you should make users do this, then that. I would just dig up all that stuff. And to be absolutely honest, I don't remember any of the stuff I listened to. But as I started to notice that I was solving problems in a very similar way, and I think just generally my consciousness and my philosophy about how these things are done became more concrete to myself, as well as the way I was communicating, then I took a step away from things that were tactical in nature, but things that are more philosophical in spirit. So for me, I think the things that are most interesting these days is I listen to a lot of podcasts about economics or philosophy. And the weird thing is, and I hope maybe I'm modeling behavior here, but a lot of my most favorite entrepreneurs or founders, this is where all of their focus eventually goes to: economics and philosophy. At some point in the maturity of their professional life, this becomes the main thing that drives innovation in their head. So with that being said, my favorite podcast is something called Conversations with Tyler. It is a super random podcast by a very popular economist, and he interviews so many different interesting people, and he asks questions that are extremely detailed about their specialty and things that are unspecial to them. He's interviewed everyone from Mark Zuckerberg to the CEO of Stripe, to also a Russian philosopher writer, to a person who did the longest, who did a rewriting of the Odyssey. So really everything from literature to arts to philosophy to tech startups, this guy interviews all of them. It's all independent. There's no funding. It's all donated by users and all that stuff. The quality is very good. So I highly recommend that one. The second podcast, which is more technical and techie and whatever, it's the NFX thing I talked about earlier. I believe these are some of my favorite interviews. And I would say every single podcast, every single article, they put so much work into it and the quality is amazing. I always gain a lot of knowledge from it. So mainly those are the 2 podcasts I listen to, and everything else is really pretty dry: economics, capital markets, these kind of things. But those 2 are probably the most tangible examples I can give to people.
Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot for sharing. I posted the links to those 2 guys for you in the chat, also on YouTube. I don't see any questions on YouTube right now, so we will be finishing the stream, but please stay, because then we can ask more questions. Let me just show my last slide. So thanks to everyone who was watching us on YouTube. You're welcome to join on Zoom. The link was posted in the chat. Please come again. Find us on Meetup, Product Management People. Join us in our chat on Telegram, Product People, and support us on Patreon on Product People. Next week, we will be back with a more interesting talk, so please come. And now, good evening to bye-bye to everyone who was watching us on streaming. And in this place, I stop streaming.